I'm James Hester, and welcome back to the School of Mars. Most arms and armor collections have at least one sword with a numerical inscription on the blade. The most common numbers found are either 1414 or 1441. Now, despite the abundance of blades with these inscriptions, very little work either documenting or attempting to identify the phenomena seems to have been done. For the most part, previous scholars have made only passing reference to the inscriptions, labeling them generically as talismanic or Kabbalistic. So, having examined a number of such blades in various collections, part of what I want to explore today is whether or not there are other factors besides the inscriptions which could group them together. In addition to this, I'm going to look at the various theories concerning possible meanings for the inscriptions and attempt to determine which may be the most likely. Now, to aid in this, I'm going to draw upon several sources of occult correspondences from the 16th and 17th centuries in order to look at these inscriptions with the eyes of those for whom talismans held actual power. For although many regard these practices as superstitious today, those that actually placed them on these blades did not, and to examine them with entirely modern eyes puts us at risk of missing something that would have been obvious to a magically minded individual. However, I recognize the fine line that has to be walked in these cases, and I'm ever mindful of Umberto Eco's caution from his fantastic book Foucault's Pendulum, where he said, and I quote, "I believe that you can reach the point where there is no longer any difference between developing the habit of pretending to believe and developing the habit of believing." Now, this examination cannot proceed, however, without first stating the very thing that may hamstring the whole enterprise from the start. It's entirely possible that these numerical inscriptions have no intended esoteric meaning whatsoever. They could be, for example, some form of manufacturer's mark, designating either a particular craftsman, workshop, or even an organizational mark added post-production to catalog blades in, say, an arsenal for ease of issue. Sadly, to date we simply lack any solid clues from which we could form a decisive conclusion. That said, since the argument for some sort of symbolic significance to these inscriptions seems to come up so frequently, for the purposes here today, we're going to take up this idea and, presuming it may have some validity, examine it in greater depth. Now, I was able to track down and examine 30 blades bearing 1414 or 1441 inscriptions across a number of large arms and armor collections. Now, this is far from a statistically significant number, of course, as I was restricted at the time when I was doing this research, this was many, many years ago, to those that I could find either in catalogs or in collections close enough for me to visit in person. However, the hope is that this will at least give some indication as to whether or not there are any obvious trends across blades of these types. In the course of this study, I came across several other blades with different numerical inscriptions. However, for this work, I'm going to focus solely on those with 1414 and 1441 inscriptions, as these seem to be the most common. Now, the two inscriptions will each be dealt with separately to double check to see if there are any possible differences between the blades in each of these groups. Now, focus is going to be placed on the blades because, as many know, blades could be recycled quite a lot throughout their working life and have different hilt furniture put on them. So we can't always be 100% certain that the hilt furniture on a surviving sword today is the exact same one that was produced at the time. Now, there were 13 1441 blades in this survey. The earliest was a rapier blade dated to the late 16th century, and the latest is from the turn of the 18th century. And the majority of these swords were produced in the mid to late 17th century. Now, as the 16th century rapier's dating is substantially earlier than the rest of the blades bearing this inscription, it would be wise to regard it with a little bit of suspicion. Now, in its defense, there is a Portuguese sword recorded as being in the collection of Rainer Dehnart, depicted in his book, which has the most amazing book title I've ever heard, which is Homens, Espadas y Tomates, or Men, Swords, and Tomatoes. Fantastic. And this sword depicted in there allegedly bears a 1441 inscription and is dated to the 16th century. The image in the book, unfortunately, is such that the inscription isn't clear, and to date, I've not been able to get in contact with either the author or his estate to get any further information about the sword. On the other hand, there remains a possibility that the inscription was added to both blades at a later date, making the dating of the blade itself irrelevant. Now, the blades range from approximately 72 to 73 centimeters to round about 97 centimeters in length, and from a little over 2 centimeters to around 4 centimeters to maximum width. All of them are fullered, and 7 of them are inscribed with the famous running wolf mark, which identifies them as likely to have been made in one of the major German centers of blade making, either Solingen or Passau. And most of the blades are robust military types, typically associated with what's referred to today as the Walloon style of basket-hilted swords that were popular in the 17th century for use by both cavalry and infantry. All of them are double-edged with the exception of one, and 2 of the blades are for, as I said, rapiers. Both of these found in the Royal Armouries collection in Leeds. One of these is as robust as the other types of blades, if somewhat longer, while the other one is much thinner. There are 4 variants of the 1441 inscription on these blades. The majority of them, 8 in all, have the numbers inscribed fairly close together with no dividing marks between the numbers. The rest have either marks on either side of the total inscription, a single dividing mark which splits the inscription into 2 pairs, or a dividing mark on both sides of each individual number. There does not appear to be enough similarity in the hand, so to speak, of the 1441 or the running wolf inscriptions to make an argument for attributing any number of them to a single maker. All the marks are subtly different. There are 2 anomalies in this group. One is an English sword in the Royal Armouries at Leeds, dating to circa 1635. The blade is single-edged and double-fullered. In the fullers is found the very, very shallow and roughly executed inscription Andrea Ferrara, 1441. Now, the informality of the hand of this inscription compared with the others indicates this was probably a later edition made by someone other than the maker. The other is a mid-17th century English rapier, one of the pair at Leeds that I mentioned previously. Now, while it's around the average length of the others, at 2.2 centimeters maximum width, it's the thinnest of the whole group. Within the fuller is the inscription On Toledo, 1441. Now, while formally inscribed, it too is not executed in the same style as the rest. Now, what these anomalies suggest is that the 1441 inscription may have been deemed important enough to inscribe on a blade, even if it was not made in the workshops that regularly used it. Neither of these blades pretend to be German. Andrea Ferrara was a late medieval Italian swordmaker whose name appears on Italian blades for centuries thereafter, and Toledo was of course a renowned blade-making center in Spain. Yet these blades, while attempting to claim Italian or Spanish origins, make a point to display a feature typically associated with German blades. Now, the owners or makers must have had some reason to have these inscriptions put on their blades, whether this is due to its association with, say, quality, or with its alleged talismanic properties, or some combination of both, sadly remains uncertain. 17 other blades bear the 1414 inscription. The earliest blade in this grouping is again that of a rapier, this time in the Kelvingrove collection in Glasgow, dated to the late 16th century, and the latest are several blades which date to the mid-18th century in the collections at Leeds, Stockholm, and Zurich. And the majority of these blades, as before, date to the mid to late 17th century. Again, the rapier raises some suspicions. The blade appears to have had the edges ground down, and unevenly at that, at the forte, possibly to fit into the bars of the guard and create a ricasso. Now, this, combined with its rounded tip and fuller, similar to some of the other blades in the survey, suggests the possibility that this blade is a walloon-style one that has at some point been remounted onto an earlier rapier hilt. If this is the case, then this blade no longer falls outside the average dating of these blades. The majority of these are fullered, only 6 of them are not. They range from round about 64.5 centimeters to just over 89 centimeters in length, and around 2.3 to 4 and a bit centimeters of maximum width. 15 out of the 17 have the running wolf mark, and all except for one of the anomalous blades are double-edged. This group is rather evenly balanced between the robust walloons-type swords and the thinner but still military-worthy blades. The above-mentioned rapier blade actually fits more into the robust grouping despite being longer. There are 3 ways in which the 1414 is inscribed. More than half of them have the numbers together but bordered by marks, while the rest either have dividing marks between each number or no marks at all. Again, there is no noticeable similarity in the hand of the inscriptions to argue for a common maker. There are 3 anomalies in this group. The first is a 17th century Scottish dirk at Glasgow. The blade appears to be a cut-down sword blade of German manufacture, bearing a typical 1414 inscription and running wolf mark, measuring 39 centimeters by 3 centimeters. It's single-edged, making it the only such blade in the 1414 group, and only the second in the total blades surveyed to be single-edged. The second piece is a French hunting hanger dated to the mid-18th century at the Livrustkammaren in Stockholm. At 57.4 by 3.9 centimeters, it's one of the shorter and wider blades in the survey. Most unusually, the 1414 and running wolf marks are more stylized than those found on the other blades. The same is true for the marks of the final anomalous blade, that of a French or English child's sword dated to the late 17th century. At 69.4 by 1.6 centimeters, it is by far the thinnest blade in the survey. These more stylized inscriptions seem to suggest not only that these inscriptions were associated with the quality German blades then available throughout Europe, but also that these 2 inscriptions were thought by some to need to occur together. Regardless of whether or not the significance of either mark was understood, some perhaps felt that a wolf mark plus a numerical inscription equaled either a good German blade or at least a blade of that quality. So let's now compare these 2 groupings to see if we can observe anything. The vast majority of these blades tend to be between 80 and 83 centimeters long and a little over 3 centimeters at their widest point. Most of them date to the mid-17th century, although both groupings have at least one that pre- and post-date this period. Now, more 1414 blades have accompanying running wolf marks than 1441 blades, yet there appears to be no clear custom as to the design of the numerical inscription. Although there were slightly more 1414 blades than 1441 blades in this survey, the small number of the total blades examined for this work, compared to the number that are out there in various collections, means that we can't really form a solid conclusion as to which inscription was more popular than the other. Now, as neither inscription displayed a dramatic majority, it's possible that by the mid to late 17th century, both inscriptions may have been equally popular. So, what is the possible significance of these numerical inscriptions? To hopefully shed some light on this, we have to get into the heads of those who would inscribe numbers onto sword blades for symbolic reasons. This is not always comfortable for moderns to do, because it calls upon us to temporarily suspend our disbelief and delve into the intricate cosmology long held to be the way the universe operated until the so-called Age of Reason. A delicate balance has to be struck to do this. Now, on the one hand, we have to look at this from the point of view of those for whom certain numbers and symbols had actual perceptible power, or else we might miss some of the possible connections and attributions that such individuals might make. However, it's also possible to stretch possibilities too far. A friend of mine is fond of remarking that a Kabbalist, if he looks hard enough, can find the keys to creation in the Harry Potter novels. We simply have to look at these numbers with the appropriate level of what I like to call magical reality, the belief that in a world in which such things like magically significant numbers are possible and meaningful. Now, in his book Cut and Thrust Weapons, Edward Wagner cites the appearance of 1441 as a talisman in The Little Book of Magic by a mysterious author he refers to only as Cephaesiel. However, Wagner doesn't mention what is said about the number, and to make matters worse, both the text itself and any reference to a Cephaesiel has thus far proved elusive. There are 4 areas that could yield possible correspondences to the 1441 and 1414 inscriptions: numerology in Kabbalah, scriptural passages, symbolism from the Rosicrucian tradition, and auspicious dates. Now, the numerological argument was put forward by Walter Rose in 1935, who proposed that 1414 is a twice doubling of the number 7, 7 plus 7 and 7 plus 7, that is. On blades with 1441, he explains that the second 14 is merely mirroring the first. 7 has long been regarded as a powerful number in occult circles. It's here that Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, in his exhaustive magnum opus of occult philosophy, becomes useful. Now, first printed in full in 1533, Agrippa's text gathered together the esoteric correspondences and lore that was then current and popular. As this text was reprinted throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, it demonstrates that the book's contents remained in fashion amongst occult circles throughout this whole time. So this makes Agrippa's work a valuable source for some understanding of the magical mindset of early modern Europe. Agrippa provides loads of symbolic correspondences to the number 7. Although 7 corresponds to Netzach, that is victory on the Kabbalistic tree of life, and is associated with the aspect of God known as Yehovah Sabaoth, the Lord of Hosts, it is also frequently taken as a number of rest, the 7th day being the Sabbath. Of more interest could be the fact that both 1414 and 1441 add up to 10. Rose claims that earlier blades were engraved with 1315, which also has a sum of 10, as both 3 and 5 were once considered lucky numbers. Traditions changed, however, so goes the argument, and 4 eventually took its place, causing the inscriptions to shift to 1414 and 1441. So by this logic, as lucky numbers changed, it was important to figure out how to arrange them so that they continued to add up to the perpetually auspicious 10. Agrippa attributes great significance to this number, by which he explains, quote, Joshua overcame 31 kings, David overcame Goliath and the Philistines, and Daniel escaped the danger of the lions. Now, such associations, if widely known, could have inspired a trend of putting such number combinations onto sword blades, as it would perhaps be thought to invoke the same power that guided the hands of the aforementioned biblical heroes. Interpreting the numbers as scriptural references has also produced some interesting results. For example, Exodus chapter 14, verse 14 reads, "The Lord will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." An equally martial verse is found in Psalm 144, verse 1, which reads, "Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hand to war and my fingers to fight." Now, if scriptural references were to be put on swords either as talismans or as exhortations to the wielder, these verses would seem to be amongst some of the more ideal choices. Now, while these instances are compelling, when placed in perspective, this possibility remains dubious at best. I'm not aware of any other instances of numbers being placed on any objects, much less weapons, that are meant to refer to scriptural passages. It cannot be overlooked that the above 2 passages were only found by consulting every single chapter and verse of the Bible that somehow contained 1441 or 1414 in some combination. Now, the cases where the verses appear relevant could be entirely coincidental as a result. Thinking too strongly otherwise runs one the risk of joining the ranks of the aforementioned Harry Potter Kabbalists. However, in the interest of presenting all possible theories, this has to be put forward as well. The alchemical and esoteric Christian philosophical texts claiming to be the teachings of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, or Rosicrucians, may also prove a potential source of these bizarre inscriptions. This mysterious order emerged into public awareness with the anonymous publication of the Fama Fraternitatis in Germany in 1614, after which many other Rosicrucian texts, authored by those claiming to have received the teachings and initiations of the Brotherhood, began appearing in the decades and centuries to come. The timing of this occult revival is intriguing, as it only just predates the earliest of the inscribed blades in this survey. In 1785, a book entitled Secret Symbols of the Rosicrucians of the 16th and 17th centuries was published in Germany. The work was intended as a summary of the earlier teachings of the order. Early on in the text is a poem that begins, "If a philosopher you wish to be, let only patience dwell in thee," and further down contains a line which might be of interest to us. Quote, "He is one fourfold God, let thou be told, as thou art a piece of clay fourfold." This idea of the unity of one and in four, and of four in one, appears throughout the text, and is used to illustrate such principles as the elements, earth, air, fire, and water, the four aspects of God, that is, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, and the person of Christ, the four classes of creation, that is, animal, vegetable, mineral, and celestial, as well as the natures of the humors of the body, hot, dry, wet, and cold. Numerically, an argument could be made that both 1414 and 1441 could be suitable representations. One of the illustrations in this volume is a table that seeks to represent, amongst other things, the connection between the various aspects of God, as well as the unity of eternity and finite time, as symbolized by the numbers 1 through 7. It is, however, the arrangement of these numbers that is of particular interest. The outermost circle contains alternating 4s and 1s, arranged so that either clockwise or counterclockwise they make 1414. The innermost portion also contains arrangements of 1s and 4s, but this time in such a way that they could be read as either 1414 or 1441. These appear to be the most direct references to a symbolic meaning behind a pattern of 1s and 4s. However, it has to be stated that nowhere is it mentioned that 1414 or 1441 were explicitly used to symbolize these principles. Likewise, there are no tables of numbers in this text or any other in the Rosicrucian corpus that exactly resemble those found on the blades. Furthermore, the symbolic meaning of this number arrangement from a Rosicrucian point of view does not seem to be that which one would logically put on a blade, unless, perhaps, in the same way that Freemasons have always been fond of decorating various objects with Masonic symbols, it was simply a way of identifying the owner as an adherent to that philosophy. Although these explanations are speculative at best, the fact that an occult movement that espouses such principles emerged in Germany around the same time that these inscriptions begin to appear on blades can't be entirely overlooked. Lastly, it is possible that, in the case of 1414, the inscriptions are referring to a particular year of importance. Now, in 1414, the Bohemian religious reformer Jan Hus was arrested as a heretic and burned at the stake the following year. As the majority of these blades date to the mid-17th century, several scholars over the years have proposed that Protestant combatants during the 30 Years' War might have engraved this year on their blades in tribute to one of their early martyrs. The fact that the number combinations added up to 10 was perhaps an added bonus to those who are more symbolically minded. We also can't rule out two further possibilities: either that none of these theories are correct, or that some combination of all of them are. The actual meaning of these inscriptions, symbolic or otherwise, could be something of which we have no surviving record, and thus perhaps will never uncover. Likewise, they could be symbols whose meaning have varied from use to use. So let's create a hypothetical scenario to illustrate this. Johann, who is an avid reader of Rosicrucian tracts, has 1414 engraved on his blade because to him it recalls the principle of the fourfold division of the universe all combined into one. Later, Georg, who is an officer in a Protestant regiment, sees this inscription and, understanding the reference that Johann is making to the persecution of Jan Hus, he has the date engraved on his own sword. At some later point, we have Matthias, who sees one of these blades, who concludes that it's a Kabbalistic device involving 2 pairs of 7, which numerate to 10, and he arranges to have the inscription engraved on his blade. But, because he wants the numbers to mirror each other, he changes the inscription to 1441. Now, obviously, this is a gross oversimplification, and it's very contrived. But it illustrates the point that a symbol adopted by one individual or group can be given an entirely different meaning in life by another. The broad arrow mark, for example, that has long represented the British Board of Ordnance, would look familiar to a pre-Christian Dane, who would know it as the runic letter Tyr, named after the Norse god of war. In a more dramatic example, many Westerners are initially shocked to see the swastika adorning images of Buddhas or Hindu deities in Asia, and they may not be aware that this symbol was a representation of the sun for thousands of years before it was adopted as a symbol of the Nazi Party. So 1441 and 1414 may have slowly had their meanings altered and mutated over decades, the original meanings long forgotten by the time the trend for engraving them on blades finally died out. So, regrettably, no indisputable conclusion concerning the meaning of these unusual inscriptions can be made here. However, by examining a sample of these blades across several collections, we can safely conclude that most of the blades bearing these inscriptions, although not all, are straight, double-edged blades of German manufacture in the Walloon style, most dating from between the mid to late 17th century. We've identified certain conventions in the style of the inscriptions that suggest that, rather than just being executed at the whim of an individual blade maker, they were made to conform to some handful of patterns. Finally, we've gathered all the current theories regarding the possible meanings of these inscriptions into one place, making it easier for subsequent researchers, I hope, to draw on these findings, and with later information that may come about, make a better determination as to which, if any of them, might be accurate. So, if you found this interesting and you want to keep track with more of my research, please like and subscribe and pass this video around to other interested parties. Also, please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page. You can find the link below. Anyone who can throw a few coppers into the hat makes it easier for me to continue doing this research and producing this kind of content. You can also find more information about my research and also my opportunities for teaching and training in swordsmanship if you'd like to learn a bit more about that, either on my Facebook group for School of Mars or at schoolofmars.com. Until then, thanks very much for your attention. See you next time.